The promise is that Cyberpunk 2077 will be improved over the next few years, including optimization updates, free DLC, and a 1.1 update that should arrive any day now. CD Projekt Red hopes for a No Man's Sky story where Cyberpunk is eventually improved to the point that it's regarded fondly in the future. Currently we are at patch 1.06, which came out on December 23rd, and as we look forward, I wanted to take one last look at this version and how it's performing on all hardware. Let's start with the base platforms and work our way all the way up to the PC version where Cyberpunk 2077 shines. Before we begin, I do want to comment on something the CDPR team said in one of the apology videos in which they claim to have started sending out console codes on December 8th.
This is why we started sending console review keys on the 8th of December, which was later than we originally planned.
That may be true, but despite asking for them daily, IGN did not receive Xbox or PlayStation codes until the morning of December 10th, after Cyberpunk launched to the public. I actually went ahead and pre-ordered my own console copies because we weren't allowed to access it before launch, and that's why I wasn't able to bring you my analysis earlier. Of course, the results are well known. On December 11th, I was able to release analysis of the base consoles showing incredibly poor performance, most notably on these base platforms. And on December 14th, I gave those versions a 4 out of 10 review because of how unacceptably terribly they run. In light of that, I have no idea how it's possible that CDPR says that its testing did not show a big part of the issues you experience while playing the game.
Our testing did not show a big part of the issues you experience while playing the game.
Simply playing on both the PS4 and Xbox One at launch made it immediately and painfully obvious that those systems are struggling. You don't need to run it through an analysis tool to see hitches, low frame rates, crashes, and a low level of detail character appearing. Cyberpunk was not, and still is not, in a state I would recommend on base platforms. Out of the two base platforms, PS4 and original Xbox One, the Xbox One fared the worst. As of patch 1.06, there have been improvements, but even just sitting still in the game, it can barely hold a steady 30 frames per second. And while stuttering from massive lurches, the engine fails to do simple tasks like rendering textures on the sides of buildings. This results in an incredibly rough experience. All analysis was done with all effects turned off, so frame rates have somewhat improved, averaging in the 20s during combat, but it's still far away from where it needs to be. On the base PS4, there are also slight improvements, but the frame rate is still very poor and rarely stable. The combat scenario I've been using for testing actually seems to be worse with patch 1.06 versus patch 1.04, and when walking in the open world, you still have these massive lurches in performance that stops the game entirely for a few seconds. Changing your camera while driving will take far too long to activate, objects will not appear properly in the world, and any kind of combat just causes the frame rate to further dip even if you're sitting at a full stop. The entire experience on the base PS4 or Xbox One is still riddled with these problems, and as they largely seem due to data streaming issues with the hard drive and CPU, I don't see how they're fixed. Jumping forward even one console generation sees drastic improvements. Having put a substantial amount of time in on the Xbox One X, the main issue on these more stable platforms involves stability of the app. Many users talk about frequent crashes on all console versions, and for these platforms where the game is playable, I hope that's the priority in terms of fixes. Looking at the Xbox One X, there are still lurches in performance like during the combat sequence I've been using as a test, where the frame rate will dip into the 20s but then stabilizes and locks back at 30 frames per second. Driving is where you'll feel it significantly as the engine still struggles with data streaming. And of course, you'll still have an occasional funny bug like this delayed head explosion. The PS4 Pro really surprised me and it fared quite well here, but there are still dips in frame rate while driving in the open world. Objects will randomly appear in front of you, but I was impressed when I saw the frame rate results. The game simply holds 30 frames per second more often on the PS4 Pro. But other issues like crashes, corrupted files, and a menu bug that won't allow you to exit the options, forcing you to restart, has happened to me on several occasions. Now, I recognize that the PS5 and Xbox Series X are running the previous generation of the game meant for the Xbox One X and PS4 Pro. With that context, the biggest issue I've seen reported, but haven't experienced myself, is that the game will constantly crash with extended play. If you look at the crash reports that have circulated online, you can see that it happens every few hours. And obviously that should not be occurring and should be the priority fix for CDPR. When it comes to frame rate, the PS5 only has a 60 FPS mode, while the Xbox Series X can toggle between 30 FPS and 60 FPS. The PS5 lacks that option. The frame rate can dip from 60 frames per second all the way down to the 40s on both PS5 and Xbox Series X. This is true even if there appears to be no enemies present. In the same location, it will also dip on the Xbox Series X. It makes me wonder what happened to make this particular location so taxing that it can't hold 60 steadily. Strangely enough, the one platform that excelled in all test situations was the Xbox Series S. The console showcased some truly impressive numbers, as it was the first platform I tested that managed to keep a locked 30 frames per second as you'd expect. There are moments where it'll dip below 30 frames per second, but it will usually catch up and keep the 30 frames per second you'd expect. It seems like the Series S has somehow managed to come out on top and surprise everyone. Now, having played on the PS5 and Series X, I really do think that the game feels best with the higher frame rate option. You get the excellent storytelling and gorgeous looking world at a more stable frame rate. I say stable because a dip from 60 to 55 is much less noticeable than going below 30 frames per second at any time. The 30 FPS option is much more stable, and here we get to see what, in my opinion, CDPR should have been targeting for the next-gen consoles ahead of the next-gen optimization patch. A locked 30 frames per second mode with all the bells and whistles turned on. It excels here, running at a higher base resolution, and it maintains that frame rate well. I would have preferred if both the PS5 and Xbox had the option of toggling between 30 and 60, however, because the 60 FPS mode has one huge benefit, and that's a generally smoother gameplay experience, even with those frame dips considered. By far, most of my time has been spent with the PC version of the game, which runs quite well, but with bugs encountered quite regularly. I say quite well, but with a caveat. I'm running on a very powerful system with auto DLSS turned on while playing at 4K resolution. This allowed me to experience the best of the best when it comes to Cyberpunk, and I do think that the game, especially with its gorgeous implementations of ray tracing on display, is incredibly fun with evocative storytelling throughout. However, I know the average consumer will not be experiencing this on a 3090 due to their limited availability and high price point. Still, by tweaking the settings on any PC I've played on, Cyberpunk 2077 on PC is the place to play if it's an option for you and you're still interested in playing after the negative reception, especially seeing it's the only version of the game that has ray tracing. So while the ray traced everything in the game looks stunning at moments, and deservedly was given praise, I do think that doing it all at native 4K comes at a steep price, especially when you turn DLSS off and realize the game can't hold a steady 4K 30 FPS with ultra specifications. Cyberpunk 2077 and CD Projekt Red have a long road ahead of them to prove that they can address these issues across the board and improve the experience for all players. For those of you who are excited, I hope you end up getting to enjoy a version of this game that's much improved sooner rather than later. That's it for this performance review. Thank you so much for watching, and for more on all things gaming, keep it right here on IGN.